Okay, I think it's 5:30, so we'll go ahead and start the meeting. Welcome to the City Commission work session for 27 July. We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we have just one item on the agenda tonight, and that is an update on Plaza West. So, who will be our presenter tonight?
Actually, Chad Bunger, Assistant Director of Community Development. We will have Wendy Van Dyne, our consultant lead for Stantec, that is leading this project for the Flint Hills Regional Council, and we're partnering with them. Not close enough, sorry. We're partnering with them on this project, so hopefully you everyone for that. So.
Okay, you can take it from there.
All right. Thank you, Chad. Good evening, Commissioners. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. My name is Wendy Van Dyne, and I'm here joining you from Stantec. I'm a landscape architect, and as Chad mentioned, we are working in conjunction with the Flint Hills Regional Council in the city of Manhattan on a small area-wide plan for the area known as Plaza West, just on the southwest corner of Sethchild and Anderson there in Manhattan. I have a presentation that I've compiled for you all this evening. My purpose here, my goal is to share the work that we have completed to date. We have been working on this study for this area for the past several months, and progress has continued, and we're very excited to share some of the initial findings with you here this evening, some of which may not necessarily be a surprise, but more than anything, we want to communicate the progress that we are making and also help share the next steps in the process as we continue to engage with folks like you, as well as other residents throughout the community, to help get as much public input and feedback on this plan as possible. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got a presentation pulled up here. Let me see if I can go ahead and do that just a moment. All right, can you all see my screen? Oh, not yet. Okay. There we go. Perhaps you can now.
Yes.
Okay, we got it now.
Okay. Okay, great. I am going to share some information that we've compiled. It is quite a bit of information, and I realize that you did get much of this within your packet for the evening's agenda. But want to begin just by reviewing the key items that we're going to share with you here. As we've been working on this plan for the past several months, we have been engaging with a steering committee comprised of property owners, representatives from the city, and key stakeholders within the Plaza West region. And much of this information that I'm going to be sharing this evening is a recap of a lot of the information that we shared at one of our earlier steering committee meetings last month. So I want to share some key project recaps and updates with you all to help convey where we are in the overall planning process. Also want to highlight some existing conditions that we've found and that we've been taking into account as we lay the foundation for planning recommendations of this area. And I'll spend the bulk of my presentation this evening covering the market analysis and a review of the market opportunities that we've found through our initial data collection phases of this plan. We recognize that there have been many iterations and planning studies looking at the options and the potential for this Plaza West area. And while there have been a lot of merit to some of the previous planning recommendations, ultimately we want to make sure that what these recommendations include are really rooted in market context. We want our planning recommendations to be feasible and accessible and something that can actually be implemented. So we are spending quite a bit of time focusing on market recommendations and existing market conditions that will influence the development potential of this site. Also want to share some initial thoughts regarding community feedback that we heard through our first public open house at the end of May. And then also we'll identify what those next steps are as we move throughout the planning process. The overall process that we've been embarking on is divided into 4 key areas or 4 key phases. The first phase has really been focused on learning the place, reviewing existing conditions and previous studies, as well as assessing the market conditions and visiting with stakeholders. The second phase of the planning process is really focused on exploring the possibilities, starting to, based on the information that we've gathered, start to assemble some potential reinvestment and redevelopment scenarios. And then the third phase of the plan, which we'll be moving into over the next month or two, we'll be starting to turn those plans into action, starting to define that preferred direction, identifying what those public realm improvements, whether they be green space options, streetscaping options, connectivity, trail development, what those might be and how they can support the redevelopment of the site. And then finally, the fourth phase of this planning study will be focused on implementing priorities. That's assembling all of our recommendations into a cohesive document and presenting that document and those recommendations to you all at the City Commission for review and consideration. This planning study, I should mention, is being funded through an EPA Brownfields grant that was procured through the Flint Hills Regional Council in 2018. So the purpose of this grant has some really phenomenal impacts and can really be used to help revitalize underserved sites that could be classified as brownfields into a higher and better use for the community and help to restore the environment to protect the overall health and vibrancy of the community. So it's been a real pleasure that we can utilize this funding opportunity to benefit the city of Manhattan and the residents in and around the study area. Our schedule has really been focused over the past several months, really kicking off in earnest around February and March of this year. Looking at the different phases that I just described, we really kicked this off with the phase one, an analysis of existing conditions very earlier this spring. We had a public engagement event in late May of this year where we were able to get some additional feedback from residents of this area and key stakeholders who are interested in this study. And where we are right now is we're beginning to take that information and we're really starting to identify what those planning scenarios might be based upon the existing conditions that we know today. And so we will be returning to Manhattan next week, and we will be hosting a community open house next Wednesday, August 4th at the Classic Car Museum on Plaza West from 4:30 to 7:00 p.m. to help share some preliminary ideas and solicit input and have a productive dialogue with residents and stakeholders who are interested in providing their thoughts. We're looking at concluding the project ideally sometime around August, September, but although we do have some flexibility, especially as we start to synthesize some of the information from the community, to extend the project final deliverables out into October if need be. So we do have some flexibility as we start to work with feedback and input and solicit ideas from the community. The overall study area that we're looking at for the Plaza West side is everything here that you see contained within the yellow line. You will find that while we are focused primarily on the commercial establishments and the commercial area at the southwest corner of Sethchild and Anderson, there are some neighborhoods immediately to the east, or excuse me, to the west of the commercial district that are also included in this planning study. Again, all of this, we identified this planning area through the direction of the Manhattan's Planning Department, through Eric Cattell and Chad Bunger. And we also have notified all the property owners who are included within this study area about the study and have been keeping them apprised of the various events through the public website and through direct correspondence. And looking at the existing conditions, we'd be remiss not to acknowledge the significant flooding impacts that this area has received in recent memory. Certainly one of the key items that we are looking at in conjunction with all of the other aspects that I'll go through here in a moment are the natural impacts of flooding and stormwater drainage on this area. Ultimately, what we want to evaluate with any of our planning scenarios is the long-term resiliency and ways that we can help mitigate the impacts of flooding, not only to those property owners who choose to establish their business within this area, but also to any upstream or downstream properties who are within this watershed. So that is something that we are evaluating, and it's top of mind as we start to synthesize all this information and look at potential scenarios that can come into play. Some of the significant events in recent memory are absolutely top of mind, and we have been hearing many firsthand accounts of how significant that event was, and we don't take it lightly that those are aspects that should be considered as we continue to move forward with this plan.
Wendy, I have a question.
Sure.
This is Linda Morse.
Sure.
On
Yes.
this map, the flood map, it shows like section areas with the category of future 100-year floodplain. When is that expected? To be
Commissioner Morris,
designated?
I cannot provide a specific determination or answer to that question. I will say we did pull this flood map based upon what's currently available from the city. And I'd be happy to follow up with a specific response, or if Chad or if there are others there in the audience who can provide specific feedback, I would certainly defer to them.
Thank you. I'm interested in all things flood. So Chad?
Chad, you might be able to answer that.
I certainly can. Thank you, Wendy. Commissioner, if you remember, we have the future conditions floodplain. That doesn't put a date on it. It's a flood model based on if the watershed is built out to our future land use plan in the comprehensive plan. So there isn't a date certain when that will be. It's just if the watershed is built to what the comprehensive plan shows it to be, and there is no other flood or stormwater improvements created, this is what the flood water is expected to be for a 100-year storm or 1% annual chance storm. So that's what that's what this our floodplain regulations are based on, is this future conditions flood model, and projecting out the worst case scenario so we can make sure people stay higher, drier now and in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. So in addition to flooding impacts and stormwater drainage, we're also considering existing conditions in terms of development patterns. As you all know, Plaza West is situated in an area of the west side of Manhattan that is very near a commercial hub. In fact, it's near West Loop Plaza, which is one of the key commercial hubs on the west side or serving the west side of Manhattan. So everything that you see here in red certainly helps indicate as such. And then everything that you see here in yellow also is indicative of some of the residential units that are also immediately adjacent to the site and are informing our planning decisions. We're also looking at the existing land use in terms of overall mix. Some of the development zoning patterns. Certainly there are some PUDs specifically on the Plaza West side, as well as within the West Loop commercial district, and in the properties to the southwest across Seth Child Road. There are some residential units immediately outside of the study area, as well as to the north of Anderson Avenue, as well as some commercial establishments immediately on the north side of Anderson Avenue. In terms of transportation, we also want to consider the overall transportation network, specifically to look at the vehicular transportation network and the roadway classifications. The Plaza West site, which you can see here in the gray with the black boundary, certainly is at a prime location in terms of being at the intersection of a principal arterial with Seth Child Avenue and Anderson Avenue as a minor arterial. So in terms of traffic volume supporting future development, this is in a very prominent location and a strong location to attract the traffic volumes that would support development. Following up on existing conditions, land use conditions, natural features, stormwater, we also have been spending quite a bit of time looking at market research. Specifically understanding the demographics of Manhattan, the population trends in Manhattan, and what various aspects of the market trends could impact or support various types of development for Plaza West. And we begin by looking at those market indicators regarding population growth. So all of this information that I'm sharing with you this evening is included in our market analysis and will be included in the final report for Plaza West. And all of the data has been taken from CoStar, which is an industry standard analytics tool that does provide data and research for market analysis, specifically for commercial properties and for planning studies such as this one. Looking at the population growth for Manhattan, if you look at the past 20-year cycle and even into the next 5 years into 2025, there has been a significant growth or a steady growth within the community, both in terms of populations as well as with specific households. As we look at the next 5-year time frame, I think that growth, from what we can tell with the data, is going to continue to be modest, but nonetheless, it is expected to increase at varying amounts over the next 5-year period. If we look at the population growth rates, we start to break that out even further, specific to Plaza West and how it compares to the Manhattan area versus the 2-county area and Kansas as a whole. If we look at Plaza West specific to if we look at the 2-county area with Riley County and Geary County, the growth rates over the past 10-year cycle, have been significantly higher than Kansas as a whole. How Manhattan has also factored against that, it's been slightly lower than the 2-county area. And then with the Plaza West area specifically, and the way that we define the Plaza West area is everything within that census block. It is quite a number of points below the overall growth rate of the city of Manhattan. So that's good information to know. Here is what I mentioned as the census block that we are using to help define the Plaza West area. If you see here, this blue star does represent the site that we're looking at specifically, that we're calling Plaza West. So this gives you a feel for where we're pulling the demographic information from. When we look at the overall total employment in Manhattan over the past 16 years, again, significant growth between the years of 2002 and 2010, slightly lower over the past 8-year cycle up until 2018. And then also looking at where those employment bases or where those employees are coming from and how they factor into the overall demographics of the city. It's really interesting to think that of those numbers, just over 12,000 people actually live and work in Manhattan. The vast majority, 18,237 of those folks, do work in Manhattan, but they live elsewhere. And then a smaller contingency of people actually live in Manhattan but work elsewhere. That could be an indicator of many different factors, one of which might be availability of housing, the price point of housing, or even just some of the nature of some of the jobs that are located within the city. But it is an interesting statistic to keep in mind. When we look at the sectors of employment, perhaps unsurprisingly, the key, and again, we're reviewing this information in terms of Manhattan as a whole, the 2-county area, and Kansas as a whole. If you look at the key employment sectors within the city of Manhattan that are going to be playing into our market context, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, educational services is the primary employer, with more than 26.5% of overall jobs within the Manhattan economy being attributed to that sector. The second and third and third sectors, very close to one another, are accommodation and food services. Again, that could also be attributed to the presence of the universities there within the city and everything that brings along with that increased student population and the support services and the residual impacts of that population within the community. And the third highest employment sector is healthcare and social assistance, followed closely behind by retail trade. Those are the 3 key areas that are aligned. As you can see with the comparison between the 2-county area as well as Kansas as a whole, it's disproportionately skewed towards educational services. You've got a much higher concentration of those employment types within your community, whereas the accommodation is also much higher, which again can be attributed to the student populations. Whereas healthcare and retail trade are slightly lower or on par with Kansas and the 2-county area, and retail trade is on par very closely with where the 2-county area is and the Kansas market as a whole. When we look at the demographics of the residents, we look specifically at not only the area of Plaza West, again, but also comparing that against Manhattan as a whole and the 2-county area in Kansas. I think with these slides, we really want to focus on how Plaza West compares with Manhattan as a whole. Again, as we start to think about how those demographics could play into the market potential and how the site could be revitalized or redeveloped in the future. If you look at the Plaza West area and you compare it against Manhattan, I think it's interesting to find that the prominent age range or demographic range of ages within the Plaza West study area is within that 15 to 34 year old range, which is actually slightly lower than Manhattan as a whole, but nonetheless indicates a strong propensity to perhaps students, young families, young professionals, and that should certainly come into play as we think about the types of uses for these sites. Followed closely behind are the next category, which is significantly lower than that 51% number, but is still higher than the overall demographics of the community, is that second demographic range of 35 to 54-year-olds. So what this is telling us is that the Plaza West area and this area of Manhattan in general is really starting to skew towards more of those established families who may have more of an established propensity towards owning their homes or investing and experiencing in some of those retail experiences within this area. Thinking about educational attainment, this is specifically for ages 25 and older. Again, if you compare Plaza West to Manhattan as a whole, it's really interesting to see that even though there is a very high educational attainment across all areas of Manhattan, specifically within the Plaza West area, it's even higher than the median average within the city, which is really interesting to look at, especially comparing to the younger demographics, more of those established demographics that we're starting to see with those trends. In terms of diversity, the diversity of Plaza West mimics or reflects very much the overall diversity of Manhattan, which is very closely correlated to the overall diversity of the state as a whole. So not necessarily a lot of key patterns to point out here, but it's just something that's good to acknowledge as we sort through the market conditions and the data that's available. In terms of income measures, it's interesting to see also how this plays into market analysis and how we can think about this area and the immediate context of the site. If we look at Manhattan, generally speaking, the median household income is this bar here in green, and the per capita income is listed here in red. And if we look at the Plaza West area, it's actually a bit higher than the standard, the median income measures across the city, which is also something interesting to keep in mind. This is a map that also helps to illustrate this context. Again, looking at the census block data that we're pulling this information from here in the red boundary, you can start to see how some of these areas start to play out, especially relative to where the Plaza West site is located. We also find it interesting to look at median home values. We understand that there are some challenges with housing in the city of Manhattan, and that the city is taking a closer look at this with your current housing study that's just kicking off and getting underway. But as we look at potential development scenarios for Plaza West, it's also interesting to look at, or it's helpful to look at how the context of median home values around the site currently sits in relation to what's going on within the broader community of Manhattan. And as you can see within this analysis, we're able to find that median home values within that block and within the vicinity of Plaza West is actually slightly higher than the median home values of Manhattan as a whole. Looking at demographics of residents in terms of owner-occupant households versus renter households, it's also very telling to look at. If we look at Manhattan as a whole, there is a higher range of renter households attributed to the community at large. And again, I think that can be correlated to the presence of the universities and the educational institutions, and with the students who tend to rent their housing more so than actually own their housing. But if we look specifically and compare that against Plaza West, those housing tenures actually are much closer together. They're very, very close, in fact, and it's almost an even split, with just a slightly larger percentile being attributed to home ownership versus a slim margin to renter households, which indicates that there might be some great potential to have a mix in ownership options for housing within this area. When we look at families and households, again, comparing the average household size to the percentage of households that are family households, The average household size near Plaza West is actually slightly lower than Manhattan as a whole, but the percentage of those households that are families is actually slightly higher, which again, when we think about the demographics of this area, correlates very closely towards that younger demographic that we saw, supports the analysis that this area does have a lot of younger families and younger professionals who are just starting to grow their families and get established. So we take all of this information, we look at the demographics, we start to build the foundation for our analysis and what recommendations that might support. And we also play that into the various development types. So we look at a number of things. Specifically, we start with retail. Thinking about retail as a whole and where is retail headed. None of us can dispute the fact that e-commerce as a percentage of total sales continues to rise. Specifically, if you look here on the far left-hand side of this chart, beginning in 1999, when the rise of the internet really became more prominent, you can see a steady incline over the past 20 years, where more and more e-commerce continues to develop, and specifically a spike here between 2019 and 2020 last year, when many of us were relying more heavily on e-commerce as a percentage of total sales. It really hit a peak here between, at the early 2020 at nearly 16% of total sales. Took a slight dip towards the midpoint of 2020, but continues to remain strong. And that certainly is something that we're going to be thinking about as we look at the retail context, not only for, nationally across the country, but also look at how it plays into those trends in Manhattan. When we look at the retail development context, the key areas for commercial districts and retail districts throughout the city are here mapped. With a strong presence of retail districts on the east side of the community, certainly along Tuttle Creek Boulevard, where there's a large concentration, especially where you've got the convergence of Highway 21, Tuttle Creek Boulevard, Highway 18, really driving a lot of those traffic counts, which help play into or help support those commercial establishments. When we look at the heart of Manhattan, unsurprisingly, we've got two key character districts, which are destinations for retail and various experiences in the heart of Manhattan, with Aggieville and then downtown along Points. But if you look at the western half of the community, specifically to our Plaza West area over here across from Seth-Child Avenue, the options are more limited in terms of the commercial centers and the available square feet. So if we, again, consider this information with some of the demographics of the area, it does indicate that there could be a potential to address a gap in that service area for some of these neighborhoods through future development of Plaza West. It's also worth mentioning that Manhattan as a whole and the two-county region does serve as a regional hub for retail, and given its proximity to, or its location between Salina and Topeka and the greater Kansas City metro, it really does serve a valuable purpose and as a strong commercial area for the Flint Hills region. When we take a deeper dive into the retail development context and look at the specific types of retail development, it's also good to note where you've got multi-tenant retail, as well as where you might have restaurants and the types of mixes that are working in conjunction with the brick and mortar stores. So this helps give an idea, especially near the Tuttle Creek Boulevard and the Highway 24 convergence on the east side of town, what some of those establishments are, where you've got not only big box stores, but also national restaurant chains located nearby. Overall, this is a retail development context map, and I think it's very telling. If we look at, overall, the retail market does have its ebbs and its flows, as we can see here, not unlike many other different market segments. But what's interesting to note, especially in terms of how the retail context might be today and where it might be going, the price in the rent per square foot continues to drop a little bit. It's actually on the rise back up towards some of the median levels in 2012, 2013, but the vacancy rates are also on the rise as well, although they're starting to level out here as we're getting further into 2021. But if you look at those scenarios here, it does indicate that retail is something to keep a close eye on, especially in terms of how we think about brick and mortar retail versus e-commerce and the rise of e-commerce and how those trends are expected to continue. When we look at the market context map specific to Plaza West too, it is really interesting to look at not only those traffic volumes, as we can see here along Southchild Road, where we've got strong traffic volumes of more than, or of close to 19,000 per day, but also along Anderson Avenue, where we do have traffic counts that are even stronger at more than 19,000 per day. Also thinking about the public transit options that are available, where we've got great access and stops to both the number 2 and the number 3, as well as great access to the sports complex just a half mile away, and to K-State, which is another mile to the east on Anderson Avenue. Thinking about the market context and the demographics, marrying those two ideas together, it's also interesting to think about how that impacts spending on restaurants. And looking at the demographics with the census block data that we have here, again, you can see within the red boundary, and then we've got Plaza West here in the blue star. There's strong indications that the households and the demographics within this region do spend a significant portion on restaurants and those establishments on an annual basis. And so thinking about the programming for this site, that's something to keep in mind, especially in terms of the mix of retail and the types of retail options that we might include in our recommendations. Also thinking about that on spending for entertainment and recreation. Those trends are also very similar. A strong preference towards, or a strong pattern towards spending on entertainment and recreation options as well. So thinking about how all this data can support the various types of retail activities is going to be really important. So in summary, I know I've presented a lot of data and a lot of facts and figures here this evening, but if I can summarize some of our key findings. Overall, the US retail economy continues to be somewhat weak, and there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how that's going to continue to evolve in the coming years, which is also somewhat reminiscent of what we're experiencing in Manhattan as well. And so it's good to acknowledge that those mirror trends are happening both on a national scale as well as on a local scale. The Plaza West site does have some characteristics for retail, perhaps mixed to strong, but the area is adequately served in respect to general retail. So we really want to keep that in mind, thinking about our planning recommendations, not necessarily proposing any additional big box retail, but thinking more specifically about those retail establishments that will cater to the demographics of the area and serve the broader community. We do acknowledge that the consumer market in Plaza West area, especially thinking about those neighborhoods around Plaza West, are potentially underserved for certain types of goods and services, and that some of those needs could also be satisfied with a good mix of retail offerings within Plaza West. So what we're recommending from a development perspective is to exercise caution in planning for general retail goods and services, and certainly if access were to be improved onto the Plaza West site, whether that be through improvements to the Southchild and Anderson intersection, if that overpass were to be eliminated and brought to grade, that would certainly help support the development of those types of patterns within Plaza West. And ultimately, in terms of development, we suspect a significant demand for a character district that could emphasize that experience of restaurants, key retail opportunities that emphasize entertainment. And this really could address an unmet need in the Manhattan region, and also leverage the presence of higher income households that appear to be around the Plaza West area, some of those younger families and established professionals that we see within this area of the community that could potentially be underserved. In addition to looking at the data and analytics, we also did conduct a number of focus groups and individual structured interviews with economic development authorities and organizations throughout the community, as well as with representatives from the development community. So we tried to take a balanced approach, not only in looking at the data, but then also hearing firsthand perspectives of what's going on in the community. Next, I'm going to share some insights regarding office development. Certainly, we've all witnessed the change in the office market, both nationally as well as locally, as a result of the pandemic. And it's really important to keep this in mind as we continue to evolve our workplace habits and how that will translate into physical spaces out in the community where we work. Within the overall office development context in the city of Manhattan, you can see there's quite a range of options and availability and office spaces, very evenly distributed throughout the community, as you can see here on this map. In terms of the overall rent and vacancy rates of office properties, it is interesting to see the trend, especially as you can see here in 2020, perhaps unsurprisingly, especially with the pandemic, how some of the rents per square foot did level out a bit, and some of the vacancy rates dropped as more people had to work from home or more companies transitioned to remote work as a result of social distancing. So thinking about how we take this information and how we lay it into our recommendations for Plaza West. Summary of findings. Overall, the office economy in the United States is weak, and it's something that a lot of folks are going to continue to keep an eye on, and I think is something that certainly changes even by the day as we continue to emerge into this new this new way of working. Overall, the Manhattan office economy appears to be moderate. There is a good distribution of office spaces. As we think about how that applies specifically to Plaza West, some of the characteristics are moderate to strong for office-based consumer services as a part of an overall retail mix. It could potentially be a good site for medical office, but the overall demand for medical office within the city of Manhattan is somewhat unclear. So in terms of how we translate that into development, I think it's good to keep in mind that consumer-oriented office should be a part of the mix in a moderate level, but that it's good to acknowledge that better locations do exist throughout the city for larger corporate headquarters buildings, and we certainly would need to take a deeper dive to understand what the medical office market in Manhattan might look like, and our immediate observations is that here on the Plaza West side, that's not necessarily the right fit or something that we would want to recommend. We also look at multifamily development context, so thinking about condos and multifamily housing. The bright spot of the pandemic is as more people are working from home, the demand for housing and multifamily housing, especially with low maintenance and with shared amenities, shared outdoor amenities, is certainly on the rise. So when we look at the multifamily development context within the city, on this map here, again, you can see a strong concentration of large multifamily developments concentrated near the heart of Manhattan within the vicinity of Kansas State. There are some other higher end multifamily residential complexes on the periphery of the city that take advantage of some of those natural amenities, such as the Links, the Marion Apartments, and Scenic Woods. When we think about the rent and the vacancy rates of multifamily properties, you can see that those vacancy rates continue to decrease while the rent per square foot continues to remain strong even throughout the pandemic and as we emerge and move into 2021. So the summary of our multifamily analysis is that the overall economy is strong. In Manhattan specifically, it could be somewhat mixed, especially when we think about the context of having single family homes on the west side of Manhattan and introducing more of the multifamily homes, what that mix might look like and how that might be received and how it could fit in within the overall context. Specifically to Plaza West, it could potentially be a good site for multifamily. And some key considerations to keep in mind is, generally speaking, it's probably not a strong site for luxury apartments. But median income renters is an underserved market. But it would be important to think about those amenities and how they can not only attract those renters, but then also thinking about the infrastructure that would need to be put in place to help to support that multifamily housing. So how we translate that into development guidance is that multifamily is possibly a good candidate for the site, and it should target a median income rental demographic in comparison to the overall demographic in the city. And it can be bolstered by tying into the existing site amenities and utilizing Wildcat Creek as an amenity and as a green space option for those residents and for the destination amenities that could be located on Plaza West. Also tying into the linear trail and the overall connectivity to the broader city should really be considered. Also thinking about how the mix of the retail and entertainment amenities can also support that multifamily residential would be a key factor in providing an attractive destination for folks to call home. The final aspect that we looked at in terms of our market analysis was the overall hotel development context. This here is a map that helps illustrate where the concentration of hotels are currently within the city. And it's very telling to, again, see the concentration or the high concentration of those hotels near the convergence of Highway 24 and 18 here on the east side near that commercial hub. Now there are a smaller amount of boutique hotels located near the heart of Manhattan, and then a limited number of hotels or rooms available on the western edges of the city. So thinking about that as a whole, certainly recent numbers, and again, this is even data from a couple of months ago, and so these numbers continue to climb. But the US hotel economy was devastated during the pandemic, but it is absolutely on the rebound with vacancies continue to drop and occupancy levels on the rise. Looking at the Manhattan hotel economic context, it has a good menu of existing hotels, especially near some of those areas and commercial hubs on the east side of town. But there could potentially be a market for a hotel on the west side of town and potentially on the west side or on the Plaza West side, specifically in support to the activity at Annenberg Park with some of the sports activities that happen there through the tournaments that come to the community on a regular basis. And it's also convenient to K-State. Thinking about the traffic that does come into the community for collegiate sporting events along those highway corridors, it could be a great place in terms of visibility and accessibility. So that's absolutely something to consider. So specifically to this site, in terms of our development guidance, hotel development is potentially viable and could be a good synergistic use with restaurants and an entertainment-oriented district. But it's going to be important to think about the site enhancements through landscaping and attracting compatible development patterns, especially in terms of residential and those retail mixes. So it's a lot of facts and figures that we've been looking at, but we feel it's important so that we can root our planning recommendations within a specific market context to respond to the market that currently exists and the market trends that we see emerging in the coming years. But as I mentioned earlier, we can't look at each one of these different data sets independently of one another. We really have to start to layer them upon not only existing conditions physically on the site, but also through feedback from the community. So as I round out my presentation here this evening, I wanted to share some of the feedback that we have been hearing from stakeholders as a result of the first open house that we heard at the end of May. So on May 27th, we hosted an open house on the Plaza West site just outside of the Classic Car Museum. And the goal of the open house was to inform the public about existing conditions, provide opportunities for folks to visit with us and with the Flint Hills Regional Council and with city staff directly to help share ideas and gather ideas to formulate the visions and the goals for the site, and also to understand how the public desires to use the site in the future. We've certainly had a chance to visit with the development community, with the economic development community, with the business community and property owners, but it really is important to understand what residents at large would like to see for this area so that we can start to hear potential concerns that they might have, as well as ideas for how the site can be reutilized in the future. So we had an open house on the 27th that began at 4:30 p.m. and it concluded at 7 o'clock. We had a turnout of about 30 residents who did attend, mostly adults, but we did have a few of our youngest residents who also attended, and we provided opportunities for them to engage in the study and for them to provide input. And it did include participations from folks all across the community, with a majority of participants from around the western half of Manhattan. As a part of the event, we had 4 stations that were set up. A station that looked at existing conditions and presented an opportunity to visit with residents one-on-one about what some of their concerns might be. And then we also had 4 additional stations set up that help ask specific questions. The first of which was live, work, play. If you could live in Plaza West or within the area, what would that look like? What would you like to see? Where do you live in the community related to Plaza West? Where do you work in the community, and where do you play in the community related to Plaza West? We had what's called a 6-word story, which builds on Ernest Hemingway's a succinct 6-word story, and asking participants to share what 6 words they could use in a sentence to describe what they would like to see for the vision of Plaza West. We also offered site tours of the area along the linear trail and up into some of the far reaches of the study area so that we could get specific ideas in real time from participants. And then we also had a station that asked, what do you love about Plaza West? What do you want more of in Plaza West? And what do you want less of in Plaza West? As well as an exercise that we call Bucket Bucks, in which we give participants 5 Monopoly dollars, and they 3 Monopoly dollars, and they can invest them amongst 5 specific buckets, ranging from infrastructure to amenities to other specific development types, so that we can start to get an idea of what types of preferences for development patterns could be envisioned here. So looking at the common responses, with the 6-word story, a lot of similarities in terms of what we heard from participants. A few are gathered here: inspiring and transformational, restaurants, grocery, retail stores, mixed-use buildings, family activities, entertainment, community gathering spaces, and open spaces. A lot of that does support what we saw and what we've been able to discern from our market analysis. So it was good to get some of those confirming angles from those who did attend. And then we also offered a site tour, walking around the tour, and the feedback that we heard was more green space, more outdoor recreational opportunities, developing this area as a hub where people really could come here and use it as a destination with their families. Having more retail and restaurants available where you can really experience the outdoors, as well as strengthening the connectivity to more neighborhoods throughout Western Manhattan. For the love, more, less aspects of the open house, what people really love are the businesses that are already there. Guilty Biscuit, the Power Cat Grill, the location of the site being that it is so close to Anderson and Sethchild. The Midwest Dream Car Collection really is a true gem on this site and is a great amenity to have there as a destination for the community. Willie's Car Wash, a lot of people do take their cars there to get washed on a regular basis. What people want to see more of is protection from flooding, resiliency, thinking about how this area can be better prepared and protected against those events. Green space, entertainment and cultural spaces, trail options, playgrounds, family activities, and mixed-use buildings. Less concrete and curb cuts. So again, I think you can see here where some of the patterns and the trends are emerging. And then in terms of bucket bucks, we heard most that a lot of people are interested in more open spaces. That was overwhelmingly the biggest area of support that people want to see in terms of how this area gets developed in the future. And certainly that could also play into how we think about resiliency and flooding events. As well as a recreational hub. There were a lot of people who, again, playing into the idea of having this as an entertainment and green space, having those options for recreation as a recreation hub. That was something that was really played into. And then also having opportunities for retail. So we have been, as you can see, very busy in collecting information. Where we are in the process for next steps. Again, we are still here in the area of exploring the possibilities. We are very excited to take some of these foundations that we've been building on over the past several months and start to lay out some scenarios. We do wholeheartedly acknowledge that Plaza West is an area that has been studied previously, and we've taken those previous studies into account, and we're looking at them and we're evaluating them against some of the market information that we've been able to find and the feedback that we've been hearing and the existing conditions. And while there is no clear-cut path towards the future, we've got a few different ideas for various scenarios that we'll be bringing to the community next week at our open house. And it's still very much in the early phases of design, or of planning, I should say. We're very interested in hearing feedback from the community and learning how we can parlay that feedback into recommendations as we round out this plan. So here we are in the planning study. We're going to be holding our second community open house again next Wednesday, August 4th from 4:30 to 7 p.m. at the Car Museum on the Plaza West site. And as we start to think about where we are in the overall planning process, we are really somewhere between that phase 2 and phase 3 phase, where we're moving from learning about the site into assembling some of those planning scenarios, and very conceptual in nature, still very loose, very open to interpretation. So we are very interested in hearing feedback from the community, and we certainly hope that many of you from the commission can attend that event next week, so that we can take those recommendations and that feedback and start to round out the planning study here within the next few months. So with that, I appreciate your time, and I will certainly open it up for any questions you may have.
Hi, this is Commissioner Reddy. Thanks for doing the work and the presentation this evening. So have you talked to our city staff in depth about that area?
Yes, we have. We have many city staff who are serving in an advisory capacity on the steering committee for this study. And they have been weighing in at every step of this process. And we've been sharing this information with them, and they've been providing their feedback to us.
Okay. The reason I ask is I don't know how most of these things are doable in that area. It's a very huge flood risk. That's why we have so many buildings demolished. And my major concern is how do we, if we can create that area where that type of flooding wouldn't occur, maybe some of these things would be good to do. But right now, I'm not sure how we can have a hotel or even a multi-use building of some kind, or apartment structures or anything of that sort. I can see this area being used maybe for an outdoor gym. We have a lot of indoor gyms, maybe an outdoor gym with some equipment, so if there's a flood, you can easily replenish those things. When Ward Morgan built the car museum over there, he made sure that the cars were able to be lifted up because a flood was going to happen. So he had all of those structures put in. So that's some foresight as a business owner on him. But most of our businesses, if they're going to develop there, will not have the same type of resources. Plus, flooding's going to happen. And so I think that's kind of what I would like to see this project work towards. How do you look at more barriers? How much infill would it take? Or is that even a possibility? I don't see infill being a solution to this area. Stormwater runoff. I think about, I think we have quite a few office spaces, so I don't even know if that would work in this area. But even, I was thinking even maybe a small stage area. People recommended an outdoor, other type of entertainment. We have the pavilion at our city park, so maybe even an outdoor space with a smaller stage. Sometimes I see greenhouse and gardening going on out there, something that's okay with flooding. Not okay with it, but at least can survive flooding. So I think that's my major concern, is the flooding issues we have there. Otherwise, the projects you have brought up with the study that you did are doable, except for the flooding piece of it. So I think there needs to be more conversations of that happening, unless our staff said, yeah, those are good to go. But I don't see that. At least we didn't have that conversation. So thank you, though.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, because, you know, you hit it right on the head. I mean, one of the slides showed the flooding. And we've been working on flooding in the city for 10 years. The city just brought out 3 properties on the west end of that because, you know, the last flood caused a collapse of the basements. And so, you know, in my mind, a good portion of these recommendations are absolutely not doable. Because if you were to do anything like infill or raise the Rock Island road bed all that's gonna do, if you look at that future flooding map, is push more water into West Loop, and it'll be, you know, out in front of Marshall's and in front of Dillon's. And it just doesn't look doable. And so somebody's got to take a hard look at, okay, there's a lot of property there. How can you use it in a manner where you're not going to change the flood map? And that's where my primary concern is. And I think there are probably some things that you can do in that area, you know, recreation-wise and things of that nature. But as far as, you know, multifamily housing in the floodplain, I think not. That needs to be stricken from, you know, any consideration. And the other thing that disturbs me about the process, and you mentioned it once, it's not on the slides, is the idea of taking down the overpass on Seth Childs and making that a boulevard. And I saw some charts on that earlier, and I live over on the west side, and I talked to a number of people, and that is just an absolute no-go. I mean, I know there's a little bit of a traffic jam there every once in a while at 4:30, but turning that into a boulevard at grade level is not going to help matters at all. So I'm 100% against any discussion on that idea, and Chad knows that. I've spoken with him a couple times on that. I think that's just not feasible. But it's going to take some creative ideas to figure out what to actually do with those properties. And the idea of you know, raising the Rock Island roadbed, which basically has kept the water out of there most of the time. It only jumped that roadbed once since 1978, and that was in that last flood. Once before, it went underneath a pipe because we didn't have a flapper gate on it, and it got in there. So it, you know, it's not that likely that it's going to happen, I don't think, you know, very often, but still, you know, we can't take the risk, and we don't want to do something like happened at Pebblebrook Apartments, where they built a levee system that diverted Wildcat Creek. And if we did that there, it's just going to make things worse, you know, farther downstream or West Loop. And so I'm 100% concerned about the flooding aspect, and Commissioner Reddy's right on the money on that one.
Wendy, Linda Morse. I think that the city staff, administration, would have pretty much known how we as commissioners would react to anything about flooding in this area, given the crisis that, you know, our community went through before. So I'm interested in hearing your, what you come up with, and I think it's something we need to take a look at. Is there part of this property that is doable? Is there any of it? So that we're going to be looking at that. Just so you know ahead of time, we're not going to probably give up on that. I do have a question or two. When you say two county, are you looking at Geary County, Riley County, or Potawatomi County, Riley County?
Geary County, Riley County.
Geary, okay, good. That's what I wondered. I would have guessed that, but we're so close to Potawatomi County, it would have been easy to do it the other way. What about the residential district on the west side of that boundary that you've identified? And is this something that the residents want to do? Is this, I mean, what we've said is that no area that is that doesn't want to participate has to. How's that working? I mean, that's quite a few properties.
Yeah, so within the study area, all property owners have been notified, and through direct mailings and correspondence from the city. Specifically, as we prepared for our first community engagement event, we did distribute flyers throughout the area, and we did have a number of residents who did participate in that first community open house. So we are starting to get some of that engagement, and we are actively trying to make sure that we can get their thoughts. And even if they cannot attend the open house next week, we will continue to post means of engaging with us on the Engage MHK Plaza West site that we've got set up for this. I will say that of those residents who did attend, there was a lot of support for open space amenities, green space amenities, and how that can benefit them in those residential areas along those western fringes of town. We did also hear, we've heard from a number of stakeholders that having more restaurant options on the west side of town, and having connections to trails where they could get on their bike and walk to a restaurant bike to a restaurant from their home would be a desirable thing to have within this area. So those are some of the initial thoughts and feedback that we've been hearing, but we continue to find ways to engage them and get them, give them opportunities to visit with us.
Are you actually going to be making recommendations with regard to the flood mitigation pieces?
I'm so happy that you mentioned that, and I do want to acknowledge the previous comments that have come from the commission and from commissioners. Again, we do not take it lightly that this area is very prone to catastrophic flooding events. Part of our analysis in looking at this is going to be including recommendations within our plan that consider the cut-fill ratios and what would be required to help mitigate and defend against those flood events, not only specifically to this site, but also upstream and downstream of this site. So that absolutely is top of mind. We're going to be looking at developable area. When we look at those revised floodplain maps, okay, if development does happen, where are the most feasible areas of this site where that could be realized? And that's something that we will take into account with the scenarios that we share with the community. Also, in terms of infrastructure, we absolutely acknowledge the cost of infrastructure, especially in flood-prone areas, can be prohibitive to development. And what we will do through this planning study and what we've been asked to do by the city is consider how funding opportunities, whether they be through FEMA BRIC grants, which is BRIC, stands for Building Resiliency in Communities, how those funding opportunities can help pay for those infrastructure improvements and can help offset some of those development costs for property owners. So as we look at that, those will absolutely come into consideration. Again, what are some of those alternative funding measures that are available to property owners should they choose to embark on some of these concepts? In regard to the Seth Child and the Anderson interchange, and if that were to stay as it is with the overpass, or if it would be moved to at grade, again, that was one of those aspects that we saw in some of the previous planning documents that we reviewed, and is certainly something that we should consider, whether or not that's a reality or not. We are looking at some scenarios that include that as a possible option, because we should plan the site in response to that possibly being a scenario, but we're also looking at scenarios where that is not an option, and where Seth Child and Anderson remains as it is today with the overpass. So if I could emphasize anything, it's that we are still very much in the process of developing ideas. We've gathered a lot of information. Now how we synthesize that information and how we put that into a planning recommendation, it's absolutely going to have to take all of that into consideration with resiliency and flood mitigation top of mind.
Commissioner Hattisall here for a sec. Going back to Commissioner Morse's question about the residential areas west of the commercial space, was this considered, was it included because of the fact that it is at risk with the flood stuff too, or was it included as potential redevelopment area? If we start doing something with the commercial area that we might need to spill over and create and glomp onto more land over there, which of those, or was there a different reason to include it like that?
We took the study area directly as a recommendation from city staff, so I'll defer to Chad Bunger to answer that question.
There you go.
Thanks. Jared, I don't know. That mic's working. I'm using Rob's mic, I'm using my mic. I just come to the podium. Come to the podium? All right.
Oh, now it's working.
Am I working now?
Yeah. No, never mind.
Sorry for the technical difficulties. Chad Bunger, Assistant Director. Staff suggested that those homes be added into the study area. Not that we had a particular concept in mind or thought those homes should no longer be there, etc. It's just that the city, through project or mitigation acquisition, owns a number of those former residential properties on the west boundary of the site, and they're now open parkland. So depending on what the development plans shake out to be, it makes sense to have that as a cohesive area with our open space parkland, and then goes into the commercial area. So I don't know if there's going to be necessarily a development plan that would mean those homes do not need to be there any longer. Regardless of what that is, it would be a voluntary process with the city to make that occur. But also the addition to that, they are at flood risk, some of those homes. So that was another element to include them.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, going, as far as the floodplain part goes, is, unless they're gonna put everything on stilts, and I could see you could put a hotel 12 foot up, with the ground floor's parking, and build a hotel on top of it maybe, and you could maybe do that with some apartments, but that's gonna, without doing some significant changes to the level of the ground there, it's gonna get, and you mentioned medium-priced housing is probably gonna be not affordable, won't cash flow without some help of some kind or government involvement, and I don't know if that's anything that the commission's willing to wander into yet, but yeah, I would be really curious as to when you start getting to how you might remediate some of the flooding or prevent future flood issues. I would be really curious to see what that's going to entail, because it's not going to be cheap. I know that for sure.
Chad Bunger again. I'll hop onto that. We all know the flood risk of the site and the surrounding area. The property itself is zoned. Part of it is zoned the 1% or the 100-year floodplain. And our regulations do not prohibit development in that area. We have to prove that the development that occurs and the fill that would occur in that site would not impact properties up and downstream and across. We have asked Stantec to do some flood modeling. Tom Morey, who's part of the Stantec team, was the state's floodplain coordinator, and he came to Manhattan several times where Wildcat Creek flooded, so he's fully aware of the flood risks, and so that's being taken into consideration. There is a big chunk, especially along Anderson Avenue of the site, that is outside of any high-risk flood zone. I think there is some good opportunity to balance the site better to where, technically speaking, if the property owners wanted to go fill the whole site right now, as long as they could prove to us that the amount of fill would not impact adjacent properties, raise that flood elevation, they could go do that. Probably not be the most popular thing to do. But I do think there is some good opportunity to balance the site where you can raise the property closer to Anderson Avenue, get it high and dry and out of it, lower the backside that's closer to the creek, create some green space, some amenities, have the site drain appropriately, and we could have a pretty good development there. And that's what Stantec's going to hopefully provide to us here in short order, is to show some development plans that are resilient to flooding and are feasible into the market for Manhattan.
Either that or a Topgolf.
Yeah, or the other alternative is we have what we have today, and or we don't like it, then the city has to buy out that area and keep it as a park space. So, we have options, but I think there's some pretty good options there if we're open-minded and believe in the floodplain modeling.
And commissioners, if I could just add to that, and I appreciate, Chad, your explanation and expounding on those next steps. Tom Morey will be at our open house next week, and we have been working with him on an updated model to better understand what those flooding impacts are, especially as it relates to development. So we are absolutely looking at in conjunction with some of these different scenarios. And as Chad mentioned, the frontage along Anderson certainly is the highest ground along that area, and is on the very fringes and in many areas outside of that floodplain area. So those are prime opportunities for development, not only for the Plaza West side, but also to help build up the commercial corridor on the west side of Manhattan and along the Anderson Avenue area. So that's really what you are going to see in some of the various scenarios. And again, I'm referring to them as scenarios because there are so many different ways that you can look at this in terms of resiliency, whether it's just completely as a green space, which brings its own set of challenges in terms of operations and maintenance and who takes ownership over that, versus if there are various aspects of this that are or could support development and still retain resiliency for flooding events and can contribute to the local economy and to that local tax base. So that's absolutely something that we're going to be looking at.
Wendy, this is Commissioner Estabrook. I just wanted to, I think we're all kind of on the same page when it comes to what to expect in the flooding, but you touched on, in the 6-word story, the most common responses: the family activities, entertainment, community gathering, and an open space. And just from the limited conversations I've had with people, like, it is those types of ideas, what we can, what's missing in our community, and what would we like to have for families or kids to get into, go-karts, Top Golf, that type of stuff. That I was just wondering if you had anything coming your way along those lines, because that the only time that's really mentioned in this report so far is in that 6-word story. But as far as practicality, can it manage? Would it work there? Those type of things. Certainly, I would be interested in hearing more about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there are two different ways that you can think about recreation opportunities. You can think about it in passive recreation, those open spaces that are generally either owned and operated by parks and recreation entities or by the city or by private property owners through development and through developers and property owners, or property management companies. But then there are also the retail entertainment venues, which, as you allude to, include places like Top Golf and go-karts, mini golf. So we have to think about that collectively. And when you look at the market information that we've compiled, there is a strong propensity on this site where those types of entertainment retail establishments could be supported. So again, I think we're still too early to determine which one's going to be better suited for this site, but it's certainly something that we're open to discussing more with the community in terms of not only as elected officials what you would like to see, but also what the community would like to see.
Commissioners, if I may, this is a challenging site. There's no argument there. It is going to always have the stigma of the image that you've seen with the floodwater. What we owe you, it really is a last 10 years valuation of that site. It's declining. You have less property, you're generating less tax dollar, you've got entities that have invested millions in the site. Today, it's worth over $5 million, almost $6 million. And it's generating almost $250,000 in taxes. But that is declining. And it needs a plan. It needs to take flooding into account. It needs to take location into account. We are going to have to deal with Anderson and Sutchild at some point. Manhattan's not going to stay the same for the next 20 years. It's going to grow, and that problem is going to grow in itself. It's already backing up and failing at 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. That bridge is not big enough to handle the load that goes underneath it. It's a separate issue, but it is directly adjacent to what we're dealing with. Stantec, property owners, the conversation's at least started. But there has been a lot happen in the last 10 years. 3 major floods, impacting property values, impacting the ability to even occupy structures, tearing them down, and valuations dropping. Creating alternatives is the logical step to try to get these things out of the impacted area into an area that can be developed. That has its own set of challenges in itself. You got to take into account what's been invested. You got to take into account the private side of this as well as the public. And I appreciate Stantec, and I appreciate us actually selecting this area to get this topic rolling, because there have been flood groups that have been meeting for a long time, and it is very difficult to have suggestions and vision as to what something could actually be. Stantec brings that professional view. They worked with staff. This area is difficult. You know, Blake's here. He could stand up and talk about the investment side. I mean, it is a challenge. It's going to be a challenge. And just hearing your comments tonight, I'm sure he is a little bit concerned about what he's going to be able to do with his property, because there are so many issues and challenges with it. Those comments are really just prefaced with, I think they're going to develop some options for us to look at and react to. I encourage you to have an open mind with this, because we simply don't want to limit and cast away what's been invested and what's on the horizon. There are opportunities here. In order to realize them, we may have to participate. And if we don't want to participate, then we've got to be ready for what's happened in the last 10 years to continue. And that's deteriorating property values and loss of structure over time. It does take some vision. It does take, we got to get out there a ways. If you're just going to go today and look at this site and come up with a plan, it's going to be a challenge. We've got to look 10, 15, 20 years out, and how the city, how this community wants to treat this site. There are all kinds of options. I'm not suggesting there's only one, but we want to be educated as a community and as an organization with how we handle. It's a sensitive issue, and there's emotion on both sides of this topic. We know, and staff has been involved. It's a very delicate conversation, but we need to get everything on the table so we can make the best decision for our community. And I appreciate Stantec and the team that have come forward. Your comments are very spot on as well. They truly are. But we have a lot to deal with on this site, and we're trying to get you as much information as we can.
Yeah, I appreciate you talking, Jason. I don't think we're being closed-minded, but I do think flooding is the biggest, and it was addressed the least. I think that's what my concern was.
Sure.
Because once we can tackle, that's what you're going to hear from the community that's been here for over a decade. For new incoming families, they're going to say, we want a restaurant, motels, and hotels, and all of this. But they haven't experienced what we've experienced, which is displaced families, flooding, consistently flooding, businesses we had to demolish because they couldn't take care of it themselves. So I think hopefully Blake and Ward walked into this with open eyes, that it is a challenging area. And I would think they've done their business experience and portfolios and such to show that this is one of those areas. It's been a challenge. And I think long-term, that's what we want to look at. Certainly we want it to be developed. My concern is we need to address the flooding piece before a developer comes in and says, I'm going to invest millions of dollars and make this great, and then have those waters go elsewhere.
Yeah, and I do think that's their next step. I do think it's they're giving you an update on the research that they've conducted. When they get into those planning options and those development options, you're going to see that development more than likely move north, away from the water. Now, I will tell you, that probably makes Blake even nervous. I mean, because he's got so much property to deal with today. The past would suggest what's there could go back. That may not be the reality. So even going to Anderson Avenue with the development, just as a scenario, it's very expensive. You're talking about removing what's there and coming back with something else that can handle floodwater. Now you've got all that development up to Anderson. How much can you get there? I mean, there is a max that, you know, someone, you hit the nail on the head, Commissioner Haddisall. What can cash flow? This is where the community is going to have to evaluate what kind of participation, if at all. If it is 100% private for that site, you're going to get some challenges in terms of how to use the land. Because as Chad mentioned, the 100-year floodplain can be developed in. How you all are going to react to that, and the community is going to react to it, are what we're trying to bridge here in terms of, are there options to get this closer to Anderson, away from the floodway, even as far away from the 100-year flood as we can get. So those options are coming.
Yeah, Jason, I don't see a problem with, it's still the expense of moving it towards Anderson, but, as I said before, I'm all for draconian floodplain regulations, because what happened 20, 25 years ago caused a problem here. Like I probably wouldn't have voted for Pebblebrook Apartments. That would not be there, if I could go back and change time, because that did major damage to a lot of parts of the city. It was good for the developer. They made money. And I understand that's the problem. You own the property, you want to make money. Turning it into a park, well, you don't make money on that, then that's not going to work. And we don't need any more parks. We got plenty of parkland, so I can't see the city getting involved there. But I do think there could be some creative, innovative things done there. I don't know if you can make money on some of these recreation things. I've seen in some other cities where they had things like trampolines, the go-karts, like Commissioner Estabrook mentioned, and lots of kids go there. I'm not sure we have the population to support that. And those buildings were designed in places where they had like some upstairs areas, and it was elevated, and the go-karts were below, so that if it flooded, it didn't cause a problem. So there's different innovative ways to do that, Like I suggested an interim thing, it didn't go very far. We don't have any place to park large vehicles in this city. Tractor trailers, buses, RVs. This wouldn't be a bad place to do that. Maybe not permanently, but for a couple of years. And it could be used for that without doing any development, and it's a need that we have. And there could be some fees charged for that. You wouldn't make a fortune on it, but it'd be something. And so we got to look at, different things like that will work in case you get a flood, which again, it didn't happen that much from 78 till now. But you have to be prepared for it. And I understand the tax loss, but I'm not an advocate for let's make a whole bunch of money and possibly make the flooding worse. I just don't know how to emphasize that, because like everyone's already said here, we've fought that for 10 years, and we don't want to be responsible for what happens the next 10 years.
I live in Northview, and after the 93 flood, I began following every flood meeting I could go to, and and then I served on the Wildcat Creek study group. If development means, I'd like to bring it back to some use that would benefit the community. It'd be great. I mean, the whole idea is to generate some property taxes, but it wasn't generating property taxes before this flood either. It was being minimally used, and it was deteriorating significantly. But I think, so I'm willing to consider, but I have a commitment to myself that I will not be a part of supporting something that would cause a flood to impact a residential area. And so I'm going to stop at that. And so I'm going to be really interested in trying to evaluate all the proposals based on that standard.
Hey, can we have some public comment? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so we have, everything's still on the table, TIF districts, TDDs, anything and everything to help fund part of the, whatever city investment might be required or needed or desired on our part.
Right.
So there's whatever normal development tools we have, anything can be used still. All right.
Yeah, we'll take some, any public comment? No one wants to speak on the topic. We'll entice you to come up.
Yeah, I'm Blake Bauer. I'm partner with Ward Morgan at Icon, and I'm also on the committee. And so we've been meeting periodically with Stantec, and I do think there's a lot more information come out specifically on the flooding. I don't want to just waste our time here, but I've already seen some of it. And the last thing we want to do is cause a public stir on anything that's done there. And so that's I think all of these worries that in all honesty, we've spent 30 minutes discussing go away with one engineering thing they're gonna show us when they get it finalized. So I think that's great. I think that solves a lot of it. Then it goes into return. Then it goes into need. And those are all the things then we have to analyze on how to do that. I mean, the whole property is hard right now, right? I mean, you have all these curb cuts. You don't have a light. What do you do at the corner? Then how far from that corner do we do things? You know, there's a lot of decisions that probably for the best interest have to be worked together. It has to be, and there's other owners in this area. There are others that have been included in the meetings. There's others that are on the committee that are other owners. This affects them too. But it affects my 14 acres a lot more than those. And so the question is how can I work with you to get those things right? Curb cuts, crowd control, and get that property up and get those values up. There's development happening in Manhattan. Things can be done. They aren't doing that to lose money. Those people that are building those buildings, whether they're around campus or wherever they might be, they're making money. And so we just have to find a way to do that here. And we can increase those property values back up. And there's a lot to be done. There's a lot of options that we've sketched out, and I think that will come to a head. And so I think a lot of your worries or apprehension, I get you don't want to go push flooding. We don't want to do any of that. I'm also of that agreement. I think that the last thing I want to do is, and I don't plan on, for the most part, don't plan on just building and selling things. I plan on building and owning things. And so I don't want to own problems. I don't want to have more problems or tenants with problems or displaced tenants or liability on my side either. So nothing from, at least from my side of the transaction, would I want any of those issues either. So hopefully as we get through the next month and a half to 2 months, then you start to get some of those questions and some of those things that I've seen in probably in more of a working state. They aren't ready for a presentation yet.
Excellent, thank you. Any other public comments? Okay, seeing none. Commissioners, anything else? Okay, I think good presentation, and, I trust this is gonna head in the right direction, and maybe we can achieve what Jason wants and achieve what the commission wants on flooding, and everyone can use their property and make a profit. That's the ultimate goal. So appreciate everybody tuning in. Thanks for the presentation, and there's no vote tonight, so the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, commissioners.